Is curative treatment possible for some allergens? That's what I want to answer today. I'm Dr. Mark Williamson. This is Curing Allergic Responses, Science Spotlight number 18. So, we're talking about allergen treatment, allergen cures, but more importantly, the concept of allergen immunotherapy. So, I want to cover the topic of not just like treating the symptoms of allergies, like going and getting a shot from your doctor of steroids or taking some Claritin over the counter, or rubbing lotion on your poison ivy. I'm looking at, well, is there ways to actually treat it so that you're cured or you no longer suffer from the allergy? So I get it started with, I found a couple good reviews on allergen immunotherapy, and surprisingly enough, they had the exact same title, Allergen Immunotherapy, Past, Present, and Future. The first one is from 2016, the other is from 2023. So let's kind of dive into what it means for allergen immunotherapy. So allergen-specific immunotherapy is actually turns out it's been clinically used for over a century. I believe it was like 1912 when the first sort of test using, I think, grass pollen was used. And it's the only causal treatment of allergic diseases. Unlike taking Claritin in the spring or fall, or getting a shot from your doctor, which sort of tamps down the immune response, immunotherapy actually helps treat it, so that like you don't get the response in the first place, or a less severe response. Now, unfortunately, it's not effective in all cases. So it isn't like a magic drug, and it doesn't last forever. And so what allergen immunotherapy is, simply put, is the exposure of the allergen. Sometimes it's called the vaccine, and in fact, it works a lot like a viral vaccine. You expose people to the allergen across a sequence of time to build up tolerance. And there's different ways of doing that. And you can do this for different allergens. So again, each allergen can be used for the specific immunotherapy. And some of the more common ones were more like the environmental, the seasonal, so grass, pollen, tree pollen, ragweed, and mugwort pollens, but also things in the house like house dust mites or mold species or even animal dander. And because it turns out, with the allergens, your body, the reason why you have allergies is a immune response to an allergen, which is typically harmless normally, but your body overreacts. And it turns out it's actually pretty complicated. We'll see some pictures to help elucidate a little bit of it. But there's a response from T cells, B cells, other immune cells. So there's a lot going on here under your skin, as it were. And typically, especially the classically used one, the immunotherapy is injection, so shots. And you do this again, build up over time. You can do that probably using daily, then weekly, monthly intervals, and you might actually have to do it for like several years. And you might have tolerance to that, like you no longer have seasonal allergies. But this isn't last forever. It actually might only last 7 or 8 years after that before remission. You might need to do this again. So it's doable, but it takes a lot of work and it doesn't last forever. And so maybe that's our starting point to see if we can do better than that. Now, the 2023 paper here talks about some more details that kind of important. Things like allergic rhinitis, that's sort of like the respiratory seasonal allergies. They're actually often linked with other, even sometimes more serious issues like asthma, often comorbid. So if you can deal with allergies, you might be able to help maybe not deal with asthma, at least not have that built on top of it as well. And it turns out there's different ways to do immunotherapy. And one of the big, allergens is food. So something called oral immunotherapy, where actually, instead of getting a shot, you eat a little bit of, oral. So you eat a little bit of the allergen, like peanuts, actually has been grown in use. Though it's not as good typically. It can desensitize, so you don't have as much of a reaction, but it doesn't actually convert tolerance. Tolerance is where like you don't react at all, where desensitize is you don't really react as much. And so, not everything works as well. And again, it really depends on the allergen, and to how you treat it and how much you can actually affect it. Though it turns out other things like venom immunotherapy, so venom, from like bee stings, some people can like die from a bee sting, so it can be a pretty serious issue. Turns out you can do the same thing with venom immunotherapy. You take a little bit of the venom and you do weekly injections or daily injections. It actually can be very highly effective to really protect against that issue. And it turns out like these general methods, the one, the shots, sometimes known as subcutaneous immunotherapy, because of course you go under the skin, so with a shot, with a needle, it's been almost unchanged for the past 100 years. But there are new things going in. Another newer type of immunotherapy is called sublingual. So essentially, you dissolve something under your tongue, it gets into, I think, your bloodstream. It actually turns out it's almost as effective as the standard, the shots, which is nice because it's a lot easier to do because it takes a lot. You have to do this over and over again. Usually at the doctor's office, if you can do sublingually, it's going to be a lot more effective and probably cheaper. But other more advanced things like recombinant allergen immunotherapy really haven't added much. And the fascinating future sort of direction is turns out looks like the sublingual and subcutaneous immunotherapy. So whether you have a shot or you dissolve under your tongue, they actually might have different mechanisms. So if one or the other don't work for someone, maybe adding both will be more beneficial, more efficacious. So that's a little bit of the over here. Here's some images from this paper, just showing how complicated things are. We have your natural allergen exposure, and there's different cells and signaling molecules. I think one of the important sort of antibodies that get sort of produced and signaled is IgE, and that we'll see that a little bit more, especially in food allergies. And there's T cells, there's B cells, there's cells like called mast cells or bacillophiles, and there's all sorts going on here. And now with immunotherapy, so of course there's a stimulatory pathway from the allergen that, essentially gets your immune cells and going and responding and inflammation and all of that stuff here. But then with immunotherapy, you have inhibitory pathways that help inhibit a lot of these effects, so you don't actually have the allergic response, or at least it's tamped down. But you can see it's very complicated. There's a lot going on, so sometimes it's hard to detangle how to actually treat this. Here's another a little bit slightly less complicated graph of the different approaches. Of course, subcutaneous shots, that's the standard, but then there's also the sublingual tablet we talked about. But even something like you actually could take sublingually the extract and MAbs, a monoclonal antibody that could maybe some benefits. And then there's also just the extract, like, for peanut, eating a little bit of peanut each day rather than the more complicated things here. And there's a lot of downstream effects and, up things going down, things going up. And so pretty complicated, but it is doable. All right. So we've already seen here that there starts to be a lot of these terms here that start to be overlapping and can be kind of confusing. So I thought we should define some terms a little bit more. So of course we're talking about allergies here, but it turns out a lot of allergies are comorbid with asthma. So like, what's the difference? And we also have just autoimmune because allergies are immune response. So how does that deal with autoimmune? And of course, they all sort of have to do with inflammation. So how these all go together here. So here's some definitions to help parse out. So allergies versus autoimmune versus asthma. So here's a couple paragraphs from both the Autoimmune Institute and Springfield Medical Clinic. So top here, allergies, the immune systems react to harmless substances. So they react to these allergens, and it leads to activation of immune cells. So it's an immune response to otherwise harmless substance. Whereas autoimmune is also an immune response, not to foreign substance, but actually to the person's own body, their own cells or tissue, and that's not good and leads to things like inflammation. So they're both immune responses that are sort of inappropriate. One is to external allergens, one's to internal organisms. That's what they call our internal cells or internal parts of the body. That's what we call that autoimmune, the immune system going against itself or its own body. Whereas for asthma, so asthma is a chronic condition that causes narrowing and inflammation of the airways. So allergies do cause inflammation, but that's usually from a sort of in reaction, where asthma isn't necessarily a reaction, it's just a chronic condition. But I think it can be like a flare up in task can be caused by like allergens or other irritants, but it is a bit of a different thing, though a lot of times they come together. All right, and then they all have to deal with inflammation. What inflammation is, there's a couple of different kinds from Harvard, talks about acute and chronic. Acute is an immediate response for your immune system, so it's immune system response. And it causes things like redness, pain, warmth, swelling. And chronic inflammation starts with the same process, but it's usually but it becomes persistent. That's why it's chronic, and that's like say with allergies. Um, and yeah, so there we go. So allergies and asthma are related but not the same. They're allergies are an immune response, and all of them deal with inflammation. All right, and there's not just sort of allergies per se. There's other related allergic diseases that maybe we wouldn't consider allergy but related. So there's eczema, also known as atopic dermatitis. It's a inflammatory skin disease, a chronic inflammatory skin disease with itchy skin. Is actually a risk factor for a food allergy. It's not quite clear what causes it. Then there's of course asthma. We've seen again, it's a lung disease with narrowing and obstruction, and all these downstream pains like wheezing, coughing, and it actually turns out asthma might be related to allergy in another way, that exposures to like allergens or microbes early in life might actually lower the risk of asthma. One of the reasons that you might develop asthma is that there's like a delayed response to like the normal allergens or microbes, environment that you normally would. And then finally, autoimmune diseases, where I talked a little bit here, but the immune system mistakenly attacks healthy working parts of the body, damaging them. And there's, maybe almost 100 diseases like irritable bowel disease, multiple sclerosis, psoriasis, rheumatoid arthritis, type 1 diabetes. So it's not quite allergies, but again, kind of there's some overlap there. So with all that being said, like what different types of allergies? Of course, we know that there's immunotherapy to try to treat them, but different allergies require different treatments, and they have different sources, and so they have different costs and benefits and severities, etc. So this is from Cleveland Clinic. So there's bee stings and insect stings, mostly like bees and wasps. You have also dust mites is an allergies. Food, obviously a big one. Peanuts are a big one. Tree nuts, milk, eggs, fish, shellfish, soy, wheat, subsidy. These are all big ones. But it turns out you pretty much anything can be an allergy. I know someone who had a strawberry allergy or like a sunflower allergy. So it really depends. But these are some of the more common ones. So medications, that's also very common, like antibiotics. Like up to 10% people are allergic to penicillin. I know my wife is. Things like classes of drugs like sulfa drugs, non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs, acetaminophen, opiates, even things like chemotherapy or anti-seizure medications people can be allergic to. People can be allergic to mold, like general of like Arternia, asparagus, cladosporium, or again, penicillin. Pets and other animals, especially through dander. Cats are the biggest one, followed by dogs. But other animals like birds, horses, or rabbits and rodents people can be allergic to. And then, of course, poison ivy rashes. That's a big one from the environment. And what's called contact dermatitis reactions, that your skin reacts to coming in contact with these things. So plants, poison ivy, poison sumac, poison oak, and others. Skincare products can cause reactions, metals like nickel, medications, preservatives, or chemicals. And then a big one, pollen, seasonal allergies sometimes called. So tree pollen like birch, oak, and cedar are big ones. Grass, that can be Baha'i, Bermuda, fescue, Johnson, or Kentucky bluegrass are some examples. And weed like burning bush, cockleburr, even lamb's quarters, and then things like ragweed and mugwort. So there's a whole range of these. And so moving forward here, it's helpful to start looking at specific types of allergies to see what progress have been made on actually, treating it better or even possibly curing it. So we'll look at venom or insect immunotherapy. We'll look at food allergies, especially peanuts, chemotherapy drugs and other drugs, molds, contact dermatitis like poison ivy, and even some pollen here. All right, so let's start with arthropods. So arthropod allergy, there's a couple interesting papers here. First is Venom Hypersensitivity. Let's start with that. That was a 2023 paper. So we already heard that venom immunotherapy is fairly effective. And it's actually fairly common to people who have hypersensitivity or allergic reactions to hymenopterans. So those are bees, wasps, ants. So like honeybees, bumblebees, Africanized bees, sweat bees, paper wasps, yellow jackets, hornets, and farm ants all can have allergic reactions in people, and they can be, in fact, deadly. Though it turns out it's much less common in other arachnids or other arthropods like arachnids. So scorpions and spiders, usually they're venomous, but it's not really the allergy to the venom. It's actually the venom itself that really is dangerous and potent enough to cause damage. And now, first line treatment is of anaphylaxis, so serious reactions, is epinephrine, so like an EpiPen. But turns out venom immunotherapy is really highly effective. So you do, the sublingual, you do monthly shots for several years with a 10-year effects possible. So similar to some of the other immunotherapy. And in fact, it turns out honeybee immunotherapy can typically be lifelong. So actually, in the case of honeybees, you might actually be able to be cured of your allergic reaction. All right, another paper here, really fascinating. It was oral immunotherapy in alpha-gal meat allergy. Could specific IgE be a potential biomarker in immunity management? So this was actually a trial to look at long-term safety and efficacy of red meat oral immunotherapy. So people eating a little bit of red meat in a alpha-gal allergy. So alpha-gal happens because like ticks will bite people, different sexual species of tick, like the Lone Star tick, etc. They actually have this carbohydrate called alpha-gal found in like a lot of mammals, but not us. But it'll get in the saliva, go through the skin, and actually cause a reaction, causing sensitization, so that people are now allergic to red meat, which is kind of a big deal. And so doing this oral immunotherapy with a little bit of red meat building up here, they used 20 patients with this confirmed allergy, and they had some controls. Some had early or delayed onset of their symptoms. They actually found that they could become tolerant to red meat, and it was a fairly safe and effective treatment with promising long-term results. So looks like while alpha-gal allergy is kind of a big thing, have a huge life-changing effect on what you eat, you can do therapy for that. And so there's a little bit of the design here. They have this build-up phase, maintenance phase for the different types of onset. There's a very standard. Again, this immunotherapy, you do a lot. You do a bunch of little ones, slowly building up to a point where like you have this constant higher dose to sort of build up this tolerance. And yeah, it looks like it worked. And they're also looking at specific IgE, that's that antibody that sort of is up, sort of expressed when you have allergic response. And there's a specific one for alpha-gal. It looks like it kind of goes down after people get intolerant, kind of showing that like sort of immunologically, there's no longer as much of a response. All right, so let's shifting gears to food allergies. That's a big one here. So there's a good review, the immunobiology and treatment of food allergy. So IgA-mediated food allergy is also known as IgA-FA. So again, it's just like any other allergy, it's a breakdown of immune tolerance, and IgE is one of these big antibodies that like matter in sort of the signaling and immune response. So again, the immunobiology has T cells, B cells, mast cells, bacillophages, antigen-presenting cells, all this cavalcade of immune responses. And we'll see some more details here again. Now, while some food allergies can be outgrown, most are lifelong, and so they have a consistent effect on life. And so being able to treat them, have tolerance, that'd be great. And they can actually co-occur with other allergies like asthma or sorry, other related conditions like asthma and other allergies, like maybe like seasonal allergies, etc. And there's really no cure. There's preventance or avoidance. So you either have to try to like not get allergies the first time, because it turns out like for like peanut allergies, it turns out probably what was causing a lot of huge rise in pediatric peanut allergies is that people weren't feeding their babies peanuts so way too late, and then that increased the risk. So it turns out if you like incorporate peanuts early on, that can actually help reduce the risk of allergies. And again, avoidance. If you're really allergic to peanuts, you just can't eat them. However, immunotherapy suggests that if you do immunotherapy, you could be able to, maybe not totally have no reaction, but again, the immunotherapy for a tolerance or desensitization for a certain period of time. Now, this goes into more of those four routes of immunotherapy. We've talked about three of them before, but let's have their specific terms. There's the oral immunotherapy or OIT, so that's eating a little bit of it. Epicutaneous immunotherapy. We haven't seen this before. EPID. These are actually like patches with the allergen that you put on like your side, kind of like almost like a nicotine patch, but with allergen rather than nicotine. It's a little bit of a buzzkill. Sublingual immunotherapy, also known as SLIT, that's that dissolvable tablet under your tongue, and then subcutaneous or SCIT, that's the shots. And turns out there are more useful things moving forward here, like things like biologics and probiotics that might be able to boost immunobiology as adjuvants. And there's more novel things coming down the line, vaccines, nanoparticles, different inhibitors. And so here's again a picture of all sort of things moving on here. There's tolerance on one side, there's allergy of like what's actually going on, and there's desensitization. So it's not as much as the allergy. Tolerance is really nothing's going on. You'd like tolerance, but desensitization is better than allergy. And here's some of the therapeutics. You can see there's all sorts of different places where there could be interventions in this sort of immune response, whether higher up here, further along here. We'll see a drug here, omazolizumab later. You can see there's a lot of ways you could try to treat it. Here's some nice little infographic about pathogenesis. There's things with environment, genetics, comorbidities, or like exposure and how like a broken skin barrier, presentation, some of the symptoms, and then treatments. We've already talked about those. And some of the more novel ones hopefully will improve things. And here's some emerging therapies. A lot of them are like targeting specific mechanisms within this whole cascade. And so there's various trials going on. This paper was out in 2024, so some of these are probably moving forward from here. All right, another review here, especially of child food allergies. So again, it's hypersensitive reaction to food, and so there's a lack of immunologic or clinical tolerance that leads to food allergies. And again, it's an exaggerated inflammatory response, and it can be from minor urticas, that's hives, to fatal anaphylaxis. So there's a real wide range of like severity. And it seems like pediatric, so childhood food allergies are increasing, but it is likely to be overestimated without specific tests. And most common food allergies, we've seen milk, egg, peanut, tree nut, shellfish, fish. And some of the interesting things that I think this review brought to the table, some risk factor hypotheses, and we'll take a look at that in a moment. We've seen something like this before with the alpha gal, but this is the typical protocol for at least oral immunotherapy. Common with food is, you have low doses and you do a bunch, first day and weeks and months, and then you get to a maintenance phase where you have a higher dose across. Now, desensitization happens if you don't really have much of a response after you've been taking it for a while, and then tolerance is if you like stop doing the maintenance and then eat it again and see it and not have much of a response. And again, here are some of the different hypotheses. There's the dual allergen that sort of allergic responses, say to like skin from detergents, can lead to other like food allergies or things with diet and feeding patterns, etc. There's vitamin D that maybe a lower vitamin D can lead to increased allergens, and then things with hygiene. So the idea again that if you have a small family, you don't really see a lot of other food or animals, that you can maybe increase allergies. Whereas if you're exposed to a high microbial load, even in the bad sense of like getting sick more often, that maybe you aren't developed allergies as much. And we kind of see some of that with in more the Western world, you have increase in allergies that we don't see elsewhere. All right, here's another article that talks about a term called pollen food allergy syndrome, called PFAS. It's actually a cross reaction with a pollen antigen, like a birch pollen, with a corresponding food allergen in synthesized individuals. So essentially, it's an oral allergy syndrome where like you get allergic to fruits or vegetables because you were already sort of allergic to pollen, and it causes this cross reaction. And it's hard because there's a lack of effective treatment, including immunotherapy. It's kind of hard to tell, like, well, should you treat the ball, like the birch allergy, or should you treat the fruit allergy? And but there are some complications. Like, for example, cooking food can reduce some allergens, not others. So maybe if you cook your vegetable, it's not as bad, but other ones don't really work that way. But there are some studies coming out more that there is more efficacy of immunotherapy against this. And so, and some drugs, even like we've seen this before, amazazumab might help desensitize. It won't cure it, but it can desensitize it. So here's some examples. So like the birch trees can cause these cross reactions in things like apples, potatoes, kiwis, poppy, peanuts, all sorts of things. Uh, for things like mugwort and ragweed, similarly, like celery and carrot, even banana, watermelon. For these grasses, variety of fruits, vegetables, even nuts, and cedar. Apparently, it's just tomatoes. And then here are some these trials that have done that. Sometimes they use for the therapy. Sometimes use the birch pollen. Some a few other ones like they actually use the apple itself. And there are varying degrees of effectiveness. All right, so let's switch gears now to drug allergies. So there's this treatment here about hypersensitivity reactions to chemotherapy. So these allergic reactions to chemotherapy drugs, that's really dangerous because obviously you're taking the drugs to treat your cancer. And so it's really hard to have to choose between cancer treatment discontinuation versus a very serious allergic reaction. That's sort of a rock and a hard place sort of thing. Previews and cilia. But turns out there is a way through. There's a standardized 12-step protocol for rapid drug desensitization that's safe and effective. So essentially, you don't need to, like, for your life, be cured of your chemotherapy allergic. You just need to be desensitized long enough to actually do the drug. And so you can actually do that. They did their protocol with 413 cases. So they start, and this is rapid. So this is like within like about 6 hours to desensitize because you need to do this quickly. They're actually able to fairly successfully do that. So that's good. And in fact, most of them didn't have any reaction after the protocol. Some had mild, and there are a few that still had a severe reaction, but I think in all cases the reaction afterwards or during the protocol wasn't as bad as it was sort of natively before they did this protocol. So that's good news here. Also turns out things like biologics, so that's drugs that include monoclonal antibodies, nanobodies, vaccinations, hormones. They're essentially biologics are organic molecules that only living systems can produce, and they're used for drugs, and people can be really allergic to them. And these biologics usually target or always target a gene or a protein in the body, and maybe up to a quarter of all patients have a hypersensitivity that is allergic reaction to biologics. But again, you can use this method of rapid drug desensitization, and most biologics can be overcome. And so if you really want to go into this complicated figure, kind of gives a little more example of different types of drug reactions. Some you actually can't use desensitization, but most you can, or some are so minor you don't need to. But then there's also this flow chart of like what you can do. If it's a mild reaction, you might not even need to do anything. For moderate to severe, you can do between 12 and 16 desensitization processes to be able to still use the drug. But there are some cases like serum sickness or really bad reactions. You just have to avoid the medication. So it doesn't work forever, but for a lot of patients, you can actually deal with this. All right, let's switch gears to mold allergies. I have this paper in 2014, Immunotherapy for Mold Allergies. So it's a review of studies. Turns out many fungal species can be allergens. We've seen some before, but there's Cladosporidium, Alternia, Bipolaris, Epicoccum, Fusarium, Aspergillus, and Penicillium can all be allergens. But there's a lot of difficulty for mold allergies. One, there's many species of fungi, so it's hard to figure out which one outside the more common ones. There's unknown exposure patterns. It's hard to tell when people might be exposed to mold, indoor, outdoor, etc. Fungal extracts vary in quality, so it's hard to do like studies or or immunotherapy. And many fungal species can't actually be grown in artificial media, so you can't really get good extracts. And actually, fungal proteins can degrade all allergens. Some people like try to do like a mixed immunotherapy where you have several allergens in your shot or whatever to do this all at once, but turns out you sometimes can't do that with fungal because it'll just ruin everything else. But there has been mold immunotherapy trials for more common species like Alternaria and Cladosporidium that have shown effectiveness. So it's not like there's nothing there, but it's a little bit harder. All right, let's switch to contact allergies. So that's things that have contact dermatitis. There's a variety of them, but I think the biggest ones here that most people know about and probably have the biggest exposure to is things like poison oak, poison ivy. So I actually found this great paper. I had to get scanned 1987. This was a clinical trial that looked at oral immunotherapy for poison oak and poison ivy. It was a double-blind, parallel, randomized, placebo-controlled trial. There's 44 patients that 14 made it to the maintenance phase. It was well tolerated, and there was reduced sensitivity against uracil, that's the oil, but it wasn't significantly different from placebo. There was an earlier, trial that's why they did this that was significant for guinea pigs, but apparently not for humans. In fact, this is the results here. So there is, 44. It dropped down to 42. I think a couple dropped out, and then the placebo. There really wasn't any better result of people having a better response to the drug than the placebo. And so a really good sort of closing paragraph that sums up what they found is, how close are we to oral hyposensitization, so low sensitive to poison ivy, poison oak. Unfortunately, the failure of this clinical trial makes us no closer than before. This hyposensitization with currently available commercial prepared extract of poison ivy has not been shown to be effective scientifically. So several decades ago, turns out you couldn't really do it. Now, I found a more recent paper here, review, 2019, poison ivy, oak, and stomach dermatitis is what is known and what is new. So most people, so 50 to 75% of people are clinically sensitive to these. And it's actually a type 4 hypersensitivity to the uracil oil. That's the actual allergen. Now, there's been extensive efforts in the therapies. We've already seen one, but there's no entirely effective method. Really convenient, complete avoidance is the only thing that works. Now, if you immediately wash, you can really help, but there's not like a shot you can take or something to keep you from getting it. Now, Epstein et al. Study found that high long-term uracil ingestion, so oral immunotherapy, can result in hyposensitization, but not desensitization. And there's a real increased risk of adverse effects. So it's not really good uses. And there are some clinical trials for a vaccine, so immunotherapy for this, but nothing solid so far. So just a little refresher here. This is what poison ivy, oak, and stomach look like. And this is a great table of sort of the different therapies. So it turns out something like as simple as Dial Ultra dishwashing soap, as long as you sort of use it to wash up within 2 hours of exposure, can be fairly useful. There's more complicated ones, but actually turns out dishwasher soap works. There's some more things like jewel weed or ivy block or other things that can be helpful. There are some ones that you could do preemptively, but it's not that effective, or there's a lot of limitations. And again, for the hyposensitization, more like the immunotherapy, leaf extract. There's conflicting evidence on this, and there's more homeopathic. And again, Epstein's found that it could be effective, but there's adverse effects, and it took a lot of large amounts. Whereas other ways, other uses like this similar species of rust wasn't effective, and the vaccine stuff is ongoing, the immunotherapy. All right, so we kind of went through some specifics. Let's sort of start to wrap up here with more bigger picture stuff, so foils and futures. So there's this 2006 paper called Immunomodulation, the Future Cure. So broadly speaking, allergies, they're chronic inflammation from immune response to allergens, and immunomodulation is changing the immune response, whether it's immunotherapy or something else. And ideally, you're going to suppress the allergic responses, but also enhance mechanisms for the tolerance of those antigens. And so the future might be more beyond the clinical standard of immunotherapy, looking at other targets you can use. So using clinical practice is that allergen-specific immunotherapy, but under development, the things like you can target other things like certain types of inhibition of T cells, microbial adjuvants, or even inhibiting things like allergic cytokines or cell migration. Now, interesting paper here from 2019 on proven and controversial methods and theories in allergy immunotherapy. So it's important to know what works and what really has no basis, scientific basis. So things like theories like clinical ecology that substances found in the environment are toxic without actual evidence of allergic diseases, idiopathic environmental intolerance. That's sort of it used to be called multiple chemical sensitivity. It's a subset of clinical ecology, toxicities from indoor molds. Now, mold can cause allergies, can cause disease, but outside of like confirmatory testing, just assuming that if you're exposed to molds, you have allergies or toxins, isn't, doesn't really work. There's another thing called adrenal fatigue. Without actual blood readings, this doesn't really hold up. There's diagnoses that haven't been really shown to be useful, anywhere from cytotoxic tests to like chemical analysis of blood fluids, serum IgG, as opposed to ones that actually do help, which is a food-specific IgE antibodies. And then finally, what probably gets to our point here is our treatments. Uh, People tried acupuncture, dietary supplementation, really haven't shown clinical effectiveness or scientific evidence. Homeopathic halotherapy, that's like salt therapy, and even something that sounds really unpleasant and kind of disgusting, autogenous urine injections. Please don't inject urine into your body to try to cure your allergies. All right, but some interesting and particularly helpful positive side of the future is I found this recent paper. I can only get the abstract. This is a 2026 paper looking at fecal microbiome transplant for food allergies. The fecal microbiome transplant has been used elsewhere, and it turns out that they were investigating whether this could be used to increase tolerance of peanut allergies in adults, and actually they found 6 of their 15 did have a response. They were able to eat more peanuts than otherwise. And they did this in mice and found that this worked as well, looking at a certain species bacteroides were the key drivers. And this was actually a phase 1 clinical trial that support further clinical trials for fecal microbial transplant for peanut and other food allergies. So that's a really exciting frontier. So with that, I want to kind of summarize some of these major allergen types of like what the progress is in actually curing or having long-term effectiveness for the various ones. So for respiratory, so like pollen or seasonal allergies, there is no cure, but there is improved therapy. Whether that's your shots, typical shots, or even sublingual or other things like that. Insects, there's no cure, though, in except of apparently some honeybee cases, but there is very good therapy. For food, but there's better therapy, there's better tolerance or even prevention, preventing like children from getting peanut allergies in the first place. For drug, but there are good rapid desensitization protocols, so you can sort of get over it long enough to say do your chemotherapy. Mold, no, there is some therapy, but there's a lot of causality issues. It's hard to diagnose and sort of parse out where the mold allergy is coming from. And then things like contact dermatitis, like poison ivy, there's for the most part limited therapy, and there's been a lot of work on this and really haven't shown too much, but there's a little bit. So how would I rank them for like how effective or how close or how good they are so far? This is how I go. I'd say insect is probably the best so far. Followed by probably drug, then probably food, then respiratory, then finally sort of poison ivy or other contact, and then mold. So there's a lot of range of effectiveness and a lot of ways we can keep improving. So with that, here's all the references that I used here. You can find them in the description. Thanks for joining me. I'd really love to hear what you thought about this, and I'd love to know what topic I should cover next. I'm Mark Williamson. Thanks for joining me. I will see you next time.